Thank you for joining us today for this Marketing Week webinar on campaign attribution across Google and Facebook, brought to you by digital marketing and SEO agency QueryClick. My name is Charlotte Rogers, Acting Features Editor at Marketing Week, and I'll be chairing the webinar today. Shortly, I'll be handing over to QueryClick's CEO and founder, Chris Liversidge, and Head of Paid Media, Malcolm Gibb. We will have time for a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please do submit any questions you have throughout the webinar, and I will put as many as I can to Chris and Malcolm at the end. Questions can be submitted by the Questions tab, and the presentation will be available on demand on the Marketing Week website afterwards. I'm going to hand over to Chris and Malcolm to begin.
Thank you, Charlotte. I'm Chris Liversidge. I'm the CEO here at QueryClick, and today with Malcolm riding alongside, we're going to talk about some new powerful data that we can use to optimization down at the campaign level, which uses attribution. So it's long been a bit of a holy grail for us marketers trying to make decisions at the tactical end of things. So I'm going to walk through today some of the underlying technology, some of the implications that are required to reach a point where you can attribute to that level. And then we're going to go through some practical examples with Malcolm taking his expertise and walking through some of the insights and actions he would take with that kind of data. So first of all, just quickly, my background. So I'm the founder and CEO at QueryClick. I've got just shy of 20 years experience working with websites and 15 in performance marketing. I was an early employee in a marketing company that became the largest independent search marketing company in the world for a period of time before we were acquired by Publicis. That 12 years ago was when that happened, and I founded QueryClick at that point to provide optimization support to enterprise customers. 7 years ago, we started trying to answer a question from B&Q and then also from Tesco about how our digital marketing optimization was affecting store footfall. And around that time was also the very early days of it being quite easy to do machine learning deployments in the cloud and feed some large data volumes into those models. And we began development of what today we call Corviday, which is the unified marketing platform that we've developed that ultimately delivers attribution. So that's a bit of background. I'm going to go in now to why attribution is actually something that's important for us as marketers to consider, and why reaching into Google and Facebook in particular is important to us all. So the slide you can see here is data from the IAB, and just illustrates something that we've certainly found to be true in our experience working with our customers. The vast majority of digital media spend typically is tied up across three properties that you can see here, Facebook, YouTube, and Google Ads, owned, of course, by two companies. And so given that the vast majority of spend exists in these platforms and is spent using the ad tech offered by those platforms, the reason why attribution becomes important is simply that we as marketers get conflicting messages about how well our media spend is performing in those channels. Essentially, the problem, I suppose, is simplified as, these ad tech platforms are marking their own homework, and the homework doesn't stand up to a great amount of scrutiny a lot of the time. So I'd like to just illustrate that with the chart that you can see in front of you now. This chart shows the same activity. So this is Facebook activity and how that activity has been reported in Facebook's platform, on the right in Facebook Blue, and on the left in the web analytics platform used by this particular customer, a retailer. Now, it might be GA or it might be Adobe Analytics. We've done deployments across both, and we've seen the the same results. Ultimately, those platforms are taking the click data from the ad tech and the referral string. And what's different, what's causing the big difference between these two quantities of revenue that are being reported for the same activity is Facebook is applying an attribution model to try and value the impressions that its ads have. Now, the attribution model that Facebook is using to generate what is very close to £450,000 of revenue for the same activity that's returning only £20,000 of revenue on the left, is a one-day click and view attribution model. So that means it's looking at the impressions generated over the period of a day and attributing that value into the clicks that are also occurring within that day. Now, that's not even its default attribution view. Its default view is 7-day click and view, which would generate a much larger number in the Facebook column here. And so with attribution, what we're trying to do is get an answer to where does the truth lie between these two versions of the truth. Is it closer to the click data that we see in our analytics, or is it closer to the click and impression attributed data that's being presented to us by the ad tech platform itself? We know intuitively it must be somewhere in the middle, but we don't know necessarily where. So just looking at that particular problem and how it is solved today is instructive for some of the challenges that are faced by technology suppliers of attribution. Today, the vast majority of what is labeled as data-driven attribution is actually a process that you can see illustrated here, invented by Lloyd Shapley when working on aspects of game theory. Now, the Shapley model is similar in terms of its process to the other sort of very popular approach to attribution, which you may have heard of, which is called Markov or Markov chain modeling. So they're both fundamentally similar processes. And I'll just walk you through how that value calculation is done so you can understand the process that's being undertaken by the likes of Facebook and Google when it's creating data-driven attribution. So if you look at the top part of the slide, you'll see that there is a search followed by an email interaction and then a 2% figure. So we refer to that as a chain, and the start of that chain is a search ad that has been viewed, and the end point of that chain is an email that has been sent out to the same individual. And on average, those chains have, for our example here, returned a 2% conversion probability. Now, the chain underneath it, to which it's compared, in between those 2 points, the search and the email has a display ad being viewed by the individual that's represented by the chain. And on average, in the data provided to Shapley model, that has a 3% likelihood to purchase. So the improvement between 2 and 3% of 50%, that value ultimately is then associated with the display ad that has been seen. And this basically is how attribution, data-driven attribution is being calculated the vast majority of the time. Now, while that's a perfectly fine process from a mathematical point of view, it has a couple of key limitations that I'm going to talk through in the rest of this presentation to help illustrate why, for marketers and marketing data, Shapley has a flawed outcome. So the first of those two drawbacks that's worth illustrating is shown here. So this is an example from analysis we did across Wiggle. So this is about £100 million a year of turnover on the digital web property, and the chart that you can see here is a chart of the events in the raw click stream for the analytics platform that was being used by Wiggle at the time. And it's been sorted by the locale, the country that's being reported in that click path. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with how kind of web analytics data collection works at a very basic level, there's a one-by-one transparent pixel that's being manipulated, and that query string that's generated by that is ultimately passing parameters back to the web analytics server, and those parameters are added and removed based on what you're trying to measure and where that pixel is being deployed. So in here, if we had perfect data, we wouldn't have any areas that have been highlighted in red, so areas that are not a country location. Everything here would be listed as one of the countries within which that brand operates, and we'd be perfectly happy that we've got data that has no holes in it, no gaps in it whatsoever. Now, clearly that's not the case, and around about half of the data being returned, in fact, isn't giving a locale. Now, this is one example of how analytics data that we all use is fundamentally flawed. There's plenty of others. There's another one later on. What's the cause of that? Why is it that a simple tag measurement is being broken so badly? Now, I suppose the first answer you might reach for is that the implementation has been done incorrectly. Now, that isn't the case here, and indeed, we found that not to be the case for any of the Corvidae deployments that we've done, meaning that the analytics pixel is deployed as it should be and is operating as it should be. So there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the way that tag has been deployed. What's going wrong here is basically that the individual sessions that are being tracked and collected and measured by that tag are getting repeatedly broken. So what causes those broken sessions, and how can we go about fixing them? And that was the first problem that we tried to tackle 7 years ago when we started work on the Corvidae engine. And what was causing the session breakage was, a reliance on cookies to join sessions together in analytics platforms, very poor ability to measure cross-device, which remains true today, to be sure. So people, moving from desktop to laptop to mobile across multiple mobile devices, that's all poorly reflected in the sessions that are returned by the analytics pixel. Common breakages as well, just in the sort of standard order of the day, use of websites and deployments of websites. Broken sessions are repeatedly created. And, if you're watching this and you're wondering how bad that problem is for yourself, I recommend looking at your web analytics platform and looking at how much direct revenue you have being reported in there, even on a last click basis. And you'll find it's typically quite a large proportion of revenue. And that's because ultimately a large quantity of sessions get kind of thrown into that bucket when they can't be correctly associated with one of the other channels that's contributing traffic to your website. So fixing it required us to look at new techniques and move away from taking the pixel data as gospel. And the illustration on this slide shows the sort of successful outcome that we ultimately reached to perform that session stitching, so that repairing of these broken data points. The illustration represents a type of machine learning called random forest, which is a bit like doing an infinite number of A/B variations and then looking at the results to see which most closely matches the truth. And you determine the truth by looking at today and applying that methodology to historic data and seeing how well it predicts today, a bit like weather forecasting. So, we went through a process of iterating and improving that technique. And here's a nice example of the impact it has on web analytics deployment. So this is looking at a day in the life of Tesco back in the early development stages. There's about £16 million a day of revenue being measured here. This is just through their digital pixel. And you can see that those broken sessions represented around 80% of Tesco's data in that day. And we were able to repair that quite significant chunk of that You can see that in the red bar chart underneath. So that improvement, what does that then mean for attribution? Well, if we look at that exact same Tesco data, that day in the life of Tesco, just with a simple Shapley model applied, you can see here how different the Corvidae results in dark blue are for the top 6 revenue returning channels compared to Google Analytics, so GA360's revenues for those channels. Particularly standout, obviously, is direct. You can see it's a very large orange bar. That's GA360's reported revenue in direct, which has been removed and allocated across other marketing channels. And so Shapley is effective for us at this point. It's allowing us to understand that, yes, we have some slightly better insight into the decision-making that we can use. So in this example, the decision-making would be that, okay, some of these channels aren't performing quite as well as I would like, display in this example, and some are really performing a lot better and perhaps deserve more media spending associated against them. So paid search, you can see over on the left in this example also. So that's sort of useful information. Let's go back to the starting example we had and the kind of the focus of this discussion, which is how does that output look for my social channels. So here's our Facebook activity on the right, reported in Facebook itself, and on the left, reported in our web analytics. And if we apply a sort of Shapley style approach, ultimately this is the outcome you would get. So yes, it turns out after all that hard work and heavy lifting that it is somewhere in the middle. And that's the second drawback of taking purely a Shapley approach to attribution. Its inability to get much more granular than this campaign level attribution. I mean, you can still make some pretty good decisions in terms of budget allocation, but for us marketers on a day-to-day basis, we're limited in what we can do tactically. So that's the second sort of technological point that we worked on and developed in QueryClick comes in. We spent the last 2 years co-funding and supporting some proprietary research into new types of deep learning and neural networks to generate more granular attribution outcomes. So this is completely new tech. It's pretty cool and exciting, and it allows us to start doing more effective unbundling of data silos. And of course, we care the most about our largest data silos, Facebook, Google, and YouTube. Now, the way that the deep learning that we're using here, which is this form called long short-term memory, or LSTM for short, the way that this works is more akin to the way a brain operates with connections. It's not something that's necessarily write downable as an algorithm, and that's what gives it its power and its ability to get more granular than the Shapley approach. And we need to think then about what is that process doing, and how is it providing better value for me as a marketer. Well, what the process does is join for every individual interaction that we see in the raw clickstream data that's been reprocessed. We get a prediction score for all of those interactions. So that score might be for dwelling on a page, it might be for the sequence of pages that you visit, it might be for the ad sequence and then the page time. And also it takes into account the kind of meta information that's available in the raw clickstream. And when we have multiple data silos, we can then also join ads that are seen in those silos into that conversion path. So if you think about it at a very simple level, if there is an improvement in the conversion probability in our conversion chain for an individual session, and it has the same geolocation and in the same instant an ad impression was shown, that it's likely that an ad would be stitched into their conversion journey, even if we don't necessarily have a click associated with it. And so that's the process for joining any data silo together. We've done that across offline data as well, and got very effective results. But for today's focus, we're going to drill down now into social and what you would do with having attributed data at the campaign level. Now we've reached all the way to here. So on the left here, you can see comparison chart between Facebook activity reported in Facebook. So that's the light blue bar chart. And the dark blue clustered bar chart next to it is the attributed Corvidae revenue. On the right-hand side, we have the same concept for the Google Ads data. So the Google Ad reported revenue in orange this time, and Corvidae once again in dark blue. Now those are a little small, so we're going to dig into one and then the other, just to explain what's going on here and the kind of starting insight that you would get from having campaign level data available to you. So here we'll look at the Google Ads first. On the left in the box, you can see spend has also been included. So the light gray bar in the clustered bar chart is spend, followed by dark blue, which is attributed revenue from Corvidae, followed by orange, which is the revenue as it was reported in Google Ads. And those campaigns, those three campaigns in the black box on the left, are actually campaigns where the attributed revenue is more or less the same or less than the spend. So that means that they are negative from a ROAS perspective. So clearly they are loss-making even before you start trying to take into account the profitability of the particular product. I should say this is retailer data of a particular product that's being sold, which won't be 100% margin. So if we, just as a thought exercise, take the wasted spend that you see in the black box on the left and apply it to the top performing campaign by ROAS in this group, then on an annualized basis, that immediately generates an extra £1.4 million of revenue for the customer. So that's, clearly a powerful way to use attribution data to start driving campaign activity that better looks at the entirety of the customer behavior. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the right-hand side of this chart, you'll see very high volumes of attributed revenue being associated to campaigns that have little to no media spend against them. So those are campaigns where they contribute strongly to conversion, but are further away from the typical last click measurement. So they're earlier in the customer consideration path. Now this is what we've always wanted to be able to kind of measure and optimize as marketers, because it allows us to understand the value of things like brand campaigns, what those are actually contributing to our performance, even though they may be some distance away from a click, whether in time or in sequence of events. The next chart is the Facebook equivalent, and this will be the last one where you have to listen to me. I will then shortly be introducing Malcolm to talk about more practical applications of this kind of data. But I just thought it'd be illuminating to look at the Facebook side of things. This is actually a different data set. So this is a different customer, and this is showing you again media spend in light gray. In Facebook blue is reported one-click day and view impression from Facebook, and then and that's in the Facebook blue, and then in dark blue is Corvidae attributed revenue. Quite significantly different, and I've just highlighted here that for the campaign with the largest revenue, it's actually 68% less revenue than that reported by Facebook. So quite a significant difference, and because this is down at the campaign level, and you can perhaps see here that this isn't a linear change, it means that different campaigns will have different levels of difference between what you see in the ad tech and the attributed view. So that again allows strategic optimization of those campaigns. You can start building out campaigns that are having more of an effect in terms of attributed revenue than otherwise, and do other nice segmentation, all of which Malcolm will be talking about in a moment. But if we just simply apply, to just think about the value of that, if we simply apply the same thought process from the Google Ads report that we were looking at earlier, if we took the wasted spend that exists here now that we have attributed data and apply it to the best performing campaign, on an annualized basis, that's an extra £1.6 million of revenue. So just from shuffling the media spend around into different campaigns that better reflect the totality of a customer journey before they become your customer, that's a really great result. So just moving on, we're going to be going into the sort of second phase of the presentation here. So Malcolm, I'll shortly be inviting to come and talk. I think there'll be another poll being made live, hopefully. So please do engage with that. We're going to cover the two polls that have gone out in the open Q&A session, which comes at the end. Before we get to that very exciting moment, I've asked Malcolm to pull together some thoughts and answer three kind of common questions that we get when we're talking about attribution data, and just to pull some examples from customer data, customer insights that he has been working on, and just talk through his thought process a bit, talk about the kind of tactical opportunities, and try and bring to life a little bit what using attributed data does for his strategy. So Malcolm, I'll throw to you. I'll just read the question out. So this question really is around how we use insight from accurate attribution to structure paid spend, and particularly across different channels. So if you're okay to jump in.
Yep. Hello. Thanks, Chris. So we've got here in front of you is a similar graph that Chris had presented. What this graph represents is a high street retailer Facebook ad accounts over a given period of time. And it's a typical example we see once we model and correctly attribute that data at campaign level. And so it gives us a real understanding of how the paid campaigns, especially in Facebook, where it's a walled garden, are actually working in terms of true ROI. So obviously Facebook ad platform defaults to its 7-day click and 1-day view conversion window. So what we have here in the top line, the kind of slightly transparent line, is what you would see in Facebook ad platform. So anybody who's optimizing those campaigns is going to be thinking, okay, well, 14.57 ROAS, we can do a lot with that. It's one of our best performing campaigns. Let's put more money into it. In reality, when we actually take it and model that with visual level attribution, we see that it's not as effective to put more money into it. And in fact, that campaign is a retargeting campaign. So one of the key insights that we're able to drive out of the model is that even though on the face of it, through Facebook campaign optimization, we're not seen as effective ROAS or ROI, and we can prove that with this model. So in the second bar, we've got 10.42 ROAS and 5.01. That is a prospecting campaign with a very quite similar spend level there. So we've managed to drive insight out of that to prove the fact that the prospecting side of the Facebook campaigns is generating much more effective return than pouring more money into the retargeting. So in this case, we would advise this particular client to move a proportion of that budget from retargeting into a more effective prospecting campaign to generate new customers. So moving 10K in this example would generate an incremental 4K revenue per month. Small figures there, but we feel that on a much larger scale that would have much greater impact there. It's a typical example that we see.
That's quite interesting, Malcolm, as well, from the point of view of strategically, I don't know how you found it, but often, when I'm speaking to CMOs and so on the sales side, retargeting tends to dominate, the amount of activity, and prospecting is often quite a low amount. So it's interesting that you've got, prospecting activity coming out as a winner there.
Yeah, exactly. So some of the customers that we speak to often say, well, we're spending a lot of money for remarketing. It's more about 70% of our Facebook budget goes through remarketing. That is a typical scenario where it's about 70-30 split. And then they come up with the question of, well, when we spend more money for remarketing, we actually don't see any uplift on our bottom line, or we don't see any uplift in Google Analytics or Adobe. And that's purely because it's been wrongly attributed in Facebook's eyes. So when we move that shift to prospecting, then that's when we start to see a much greater uplift. So more so like a 60-40, even a 70-30 prospecting retargeting split is much more effective, depending on the kind of nature of the campaigns that we're talking about.
That's really interesting. And I think, intuitively it feels like retargeting can become cannibalistic when it's saturated. So that feels like that's the kind of behavior you're describing there, right?
Yep.
Okay. Let me just move us on. I think we've got another slide here on this.
Yeah, so this is more along the lines of we can use this model as well to actually understand how effective our reach is through Facebook as well. So we use kind of reach figures there to look at cost per unique impression. Again, this pulled out an insight for at campaign level that even though the retargeting campaign was generating the highest ROAS, it wasn't the most cost effective at actually reaching unique users, because those users had already known this brand, had visited the site, and this was highly saturated campaign. So just by redeploying, 30% of that spend can deliver incremental income there as well, 14K per month in this example.
Fantastic. Right, I am going to move us on so that we have got enough time for audience questions. So we've got another pre-put to you question next, Malcolm, about getting confidence exploring different marketing channels, and particularly including display.
Sure. So this is obviously programmatic display. If anyone is using display advertising, programmatic, DSPs, typically lives or dies based on either measuring it on a first click, last click, or even post impression sales revenue. Now, in this example, this is another high street retailer. We had to look at the data, and even though the activity was overvalued on a first click, which means that it is generating awareness, it is generating new eyeballs essentially into the business, and it's undervalued on a last click, so it's not really driving that much in revenue compared to the first click. Our attributed model, correctly attributed programmatic display, actually shows the true value of that display spend. So we were able to kind of prove that the programmatic display in this sense generated 4 times return on investment compared to 3 times in the first click sense. So there's actually more value attributed to programmatic display than on the face of campaign view or reporting view.
Okay, and that difference, although it might feel like a small difference going from 3 to 4 ROI, that might be make or break in terms of, well, is this loss making or not for me, and is this channel an effective channel for me from a growth perspective?
Absolutely. So we often get questions on, well, I'm not making X amount of return, or how much can I spend and what can I expect in return? And typically, customers will have a bad experience with display or programmatic, because it doesn't, on the face of it, look like it's returning a significant amount of revenue. But when you look at that full customer journey and correctly attribute that, you can expect much greater returns. So in this sense, we were able to prove that by spending an additional 50k through a display, it would actually generate an incremental about 200,000.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Really interesting insight. Okay, I think we've got a different channel under discussion here, the affiliates channel, which gets a lot of stick. I'm interested in your insight here.
Yeah. So this was a pain point for quite a few of our customers and advertisers. So affiliates, in particular, voucher affiliates, where there was a sense of that they're just stealing the last click. Users would go on a site, they'd add products to their basket, and then start researching, trying to find discounts, vouchers. It's typical human behavior. We all do it. However, paying for those on top of having paid for the first click and paid for all the touch points, is it actually effective? Well, what we've done here is looked at an introducer, influencer, and closer model, which is part of our attribution model, and this helped us actually see what affiliates were actually driving new customers, and what affiliates were at the end of the journey, and we're able to see that the value of each partner within the journey. So the middle one there is actually much more of an introducer, which is helping introduce new customers to that brand, whereas the one on the right is actually a closer. So that one we would recommend testing to remove that spend and reallocate that spend to another channel, because it's almost not performing a valuable action within that journey.
Okay. Yeah, I see. So to be an introducer or to have introducer against you, you have to be responsible for the first time that session is seen anywhere. And so without that, you could argue there might still be some value, but you know that it could well be cannibalistic, and given it's a voucher affiliate, that's highly likely, especially given how much closer activity, which is the last time you see that session, associated against it. Okay, that's really nice, and it's different from attribution in the sense it's categorizing sessions rather than applying a value against them, but it's using attributed revenue against those categories. So it's a nice way to kind of blend behavior and an attributed revenue figure. That seems really nice and actionable. So let's move on to the last kind of pre-asked question, and then we'll go back to Charlotte and open Q&A questions. So Malcolm, here we go. How do you take spend from bad to good?
Cool. Yeah. So this example is Google Ads, PPC. We had a look at again a national retailer at campaign level, and we're able to, and we also deployed the introducer, influencer, closer level at that closer metrics at that campaign level, and so we're able to see that these two campaigns at the start here were basically champions at introducing new customers. So when you're managing obviously paid search accounts, this is a really valuable report, because you're able to actually allocate more budget towards campaigns that are more likely to drive new customers, rather than campaigns that are just picking up that last click sale. So again, there's some campaigns in the middle there that were predominantly closes. So in essence, that could be, if we think about it, it could be brand campaigns or branded style campaigns,
right? Whereas
more introducer style campaigns are predominantly more non-brand, generic in nature. And so we can then use this data to understand how to use the budget more effectively and shift some of that focus onto getting new customers rather than just acting as a last click.
Okay, that's fantastic. Yeah, that's really interesting insight. I can see how this data, I guess, is enabling you to make strategic decisions rather than just purely being something that you could use for automation. Let's say actually there's insightful decision making that's got to be made based on the behavior of those sessions, not just their attributed revenue.
Yep.
Cool. Okay. Look, thank you, Malcolm. Now, you and I are now to be grilled, I think, by Charlotte and the audience.
Yes, quite right. Thanks, guys. That was really interesting. And yeah, we do have some time for some questions now. So if anyone's listening and they'd like to submit a question, please do via the questions tab. But obviously, during the presentation, there were a couple of polls that went out there. And I wanted to get kind of Chris and Malcolm to get your reactions to the answers to the polls. So the first one was kind of looking at how concerned or indeed unconcerned marketers are, people in the space are around the bias in channel reporting. And the poll brought the figure that 54.3% are somewhat concerned by the bias in channel reporting. And if you add on that the 19.8% that are very concerned, how do you react to that? Is that kind of what you imagined would come out?
Yeah, it's a pretty strong number, isn't it? So it sort of tells me that even though the census-wide report that we sort of co-sponsored a couple of years ago came back with a similar sort of, I think it was 90% of marketers felt they were unable to use attribution to make tactical decisions. So that was a report, I think, across 200 marketers targeted specifically at people making day-to-day decisions rather than necessarily CEOs or let's say, or budget holders. So it's getting close to that 90%. It feels like it's not changed too much. So I'm not too surprised by those numbers, even though really what that's saying is that, those marking of homework problems, Google and Facebook both, are really profoundly embedded in digital marketing, marketers' day-to-day lives. So it's quite astonishing, even though it's an unexpected result, I think.
Yeah, it is worrying, and the fact that it's not getting any better for people is, again, worrying. The other poll was kind of looking at how much the marketing mix goes on Facebook and Google Ads, and the poll suggests that 44% of those who answered, more than 50% of their marketing mix goes on Facebook and Google Ads. 42.7% is less than 50%, and 13.3% around 50%. And I suppose, when you're talking in the presentation, just the amount of kind of digital spend that is kind of sucked up by Facebook, YouTube, and then Google Ads, and obviously Google owns YouTube. I suppose, again, these stats probably don't surprise you.
Yeah, I mean, they're a little bit lower than the 93% that I think we got from the IAB study, although maybe because we've not pulled out YouTube there, that might represent a reasonable proportion of that. I think Google and Facebook being around half does represent, how it felt, again, sort of 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, Facebook really has become such a mature marketing channel now, and it's hard to kind of step back from that and put yourself in the position of, say, 5 years ago when it was still a slightly untested channel. It was still limited in terms of its ability to provide any feedback. Google was still very much the dominant marketing channel for most customers, and for most companies that we were speaking to. So it's maybe slightly lower than a percentage than I would expect, but it's still bulky, right? It's still more than half. And I think if we were to pull out YouTube and add that in, I suspect it would be coming up to that 60-70% or so. So it's a major part of our digital marketing spend. Given 2019, we saw ultimately the handover between traditional and digital. So globally, digital overtook traditional in 2019, 2 years ago, sorry. The fact that so much of it goes into, two businesses fundamentally, and that we have a lack of trust in what they're telling us. Again, that's quite a powerful response, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks everyone for taking part in the poll. So we've got some questions that I'm going to kick off with. And the first one is, what are the key components to get senior manager buy-in across the company to data-driven initiatives? Chris, I was wondering if you could answer that question.
Yes, senior managers really want what they're being told by their sort of CMO to line up with what they're being told by their CFO, I think is the headline response to that. Because and funnily enough, this came up earlier today in another session I was involved in, where attribution was considered something that was for use by accountants as opposed to marketers, meaning that often it's used as part of larger econometric studies, let's say. So you work with a Nielsen, you do a quarterly or a biannual econometric study to try and understand the overall influence of your marketing mix on revenues. And that can come into conflict with even last click reports that you're using as a marketer day to day, and certainly comes into conflict with the data-driven attribution that I've described is used by Google and Facebook. I think the benefit of something like a Corvidae data set is that it does net out to zero, i.e. it's an attribution model that ultimately joins up with the cash that comes into the bank. And so that means that it does enable data-driven conversations. It enables you to have those kind of mature conversations with the rest of business. And ultimately, I think that's how you get key stakeholders engaged, because key stakeholders want to understand the revenue impact and ultimately the ROI of any initiative that's put in front of them. And so if you could do that heavy lifting for them by getting either robust attribution data or a robust business case, then that's how you get buy-in. That's how you get engagement.
That's really good advice. Thank you. We've got another question here that says, what is the best way to report on Facebook metrics given the inability to dedupe the data between Facebook and Google metrics? Malcolm, could you answer this one?
Yeah. So I think the most important thing to consider there is ensuring that I guess ad activity is not being run in total isolation. So what I mean by that is having Google Ads account, Facebook account, having your DSP, and none of that talking together. So really, without a centralized ad server or a tracking solution, that's going to lead to kind of over-reported conversion. It's going to lead to duplication across platform. So my take on that would be to make sure that tying all ad activity together in a unified approach. So for instance, we utilize the power of obviously Corvidae to ensure that we dedupe the activity at visit level, but we'd also advise in cases to deploy a centralized tracking platform, things like Google Marketing Platform, using Campaign Manager to kind of track all of that activity under a single system, so that it is being deduplicated and connected together.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question asks, what tools are most recommended outside the standard GA or Adobe suites? Chris, do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, Malcolm sort of alluded to what a good response to that is, I think, because when you look at Google and Adobe, they still are far and away the dominant analytics platforms, right? So if you're talking about pixel analytics to deploy, you can dig around and find other solutions. There's really nice self-serve solutions like Snowplow out there, which I think has about 2% market share now, so it's getting a bit of penetration. But I would say don't be fooled by the free side of things. You will need some level of support to implement that, integrate it, build reports off the top of it. It's very powerful, and in fact, it's sort of more granular data than you get from GA or Adobe. And I think there's also a number of equivalents to the free version of GA that have greater emphasis on things like privacy that catch trends now and again. those are all fine, but I would argue that you've got to bear in mind they are going to have the same clickstream problems that I've highlighted in the presentation here, meaning that if ultimately you're relying on a deterministic, i.e. just what the pixel's telling you, you are going to run into the same session problems that Google with all its engineers ran into. So that I would say that to that side, but actually Malcolm's answer to the previous question is probably a more valuable part of this response. It's to highlight that your analytics package is part of your tech stack, really, or your ad tech stack, and management of everything needs to be considered. So I strongly advise anyone looking at their analytics solution to consider the entirety of the stack and how they're going to ensure that they have kind of an end-to-end solutions in place for the marketing activity, measurement of that activity, i.e. pixeling it wherever possible, processing that in a way that's meaningful and clears the data up to something like Core, and then that data can be integrated into wider systems. So CDP and CRM systems, there's plenty of those around, and ultimately you would be using those systems to help optimize your customer experience. So, the way Core fits in that stack is very much as a kind of data processor and performance marketing sort of insight platform, but you would still need all of the singing bells and whistles of a CDP or CRM system to do further optimization beyond that point.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question asks, what tool would you recommend for amalgamating data from various sources, GA, UTM, email, etc., to provide true insight on user engagement? Chris, could you answer this?
Well, clearly Core, but I think also on user engagement, Core, joking aside, to merge that data, it's a standalone piece of technology. I really genuinely don't see anything else in the market like that. And then over and above that, it depends on your environment. So things like LiveRamp are useful for app environments. So you'd want to be using best in class where you can for data collection from that point of view. Malcolm's point about ad servers and I think stands true here as well, making sure that you select something that's comprehensive. And then finally, I won't repeat myself, but back to the previous question, the point about CRMs and CDPs, using those to do further optimization is really key. So I think, once you have attribution data, you are in a position to start eliminating all the kind of wasted spend that you've got and maximize your reach as much as possible. From that point going forward, then you want to start doing optimization within, your digital ecosystem. So site-wide optimization and customer-level optimization. And there's a range of tools out there falling into that CRM CDP camp that are really useful, really powerful. There's loads of interesting insights being done there.
Great, thank you. Another question asks, how can you avoid deduplication of sales or conversions across ad platforms when running multi-channel paid activity? Malcolm, could you answer this?
Yeah, so that's really quite similar to the previous question I answered, but with one thing to add here. So really a kind of centralized tracking system is definitely required there to ensure there's no duplication. However, I would also stress that data quality is a really key factor, underpinning any attribution system or analytics system or, ad server and tracking. So your data is only really as good as the tagging that goes behind it. So ensuring proper tagging processes are in place for these systems to work. So, for instance, making sure UTM tagging is consistent, macros are consistent and pulling through, and that you have the ability to cleanse all of your data before reporting straight out of platform.
Brilliant, thank you. So now another question asks, how do you solve for identity when working with walled gardens for attribution? Are you using aggregated performance reports pulled from Facebook to inform your models, or do you get down to the individual level? I don't know whether Chris or Malcolm, who wants to jump in on that one.
Yeah, I can talk about that. So, we're not pulling it at the individual level. We're pulling it from the aggregated performance reports. We do that on a day-by-day basis. And that's joined in. where the customer already has access to those individualized reports through the likes of Epsilon, then that data would be used as well. So, and then outside of Facebook, where we have individual pixels that are returning that raw level of data, then that also can be integrated. So it depends on the data being made available.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question asked, if you aren't using something like Corvidae, is it ever worth switching the attribution in Google Analytics from default? How valuable do marketers like yourselves think the different attribution models are in GA?
Oh, that's a great question.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, Malcolm can probably add a bit to this, but I think it's insightful looking at the rules-based stuff when it comes to trying to make decisions just using standard approaches, because at least rules-based you understand what it's presenting to you. So by that I mean first click, last click. Clearly we've all had to use last click for the vast majority of our decision making over the years, and it doesn't help you when you get saturated or when you're trying to work cross channel, but it does help you do optimization within channel to some extent. And I think the comparison between first click and last click can help you get a sense of the customer journey that's being valued. I don't know, Malcolm, would you add anything to that?
I totally agree with that. I think if you're working in channel, say for example in paid search, the Google Analytics models can be useful at confirming optimization decisions and reporting back in revenue. But I think once you start to get above that and looking at your overall marketing mix, it becomes a bit blurry. I mean, we all kind of look at the different models within Google Analytics. They're all looking at the same kind of view of the world in different slices. But I think in terms of value, they are valuable for in-channel decisions. But yeah, I mean, something much more robust outside of that to look at your complete marketing mix.
That's brilliant, thank you. I think I want to try and squeeze one more question in. And there's one here that says, can you attribute revenue from offline retail channels to digital marketing?
Yes. Yes, we can. That's an early use case actually for us. So it kind of comes back to the problems that we were being asked to solve 7 years ago, where we were first of all solving a form of econometric style calculations after we rebuilt and cleaned the digital data. So there, for example, with B&Q, we found that 1% of their visitors, and we could identify them in an anonymized fashion, so the sessions, if you like, would be responsible for 15% of all revenue, including store revenue over the subsequent 3 days. And similarly, for another high street retailer, it was 15% of their web sessions in a given day, responsible for 50% of all revenue over the next 3 days. Now, where we have more granular data, we can map that in to those individual store locations. So essentially, it's a statistical join going on there. Fluctuations in those store volumes can be joined back to the changed behaviors in the sessions that are in the locations of those stores. So it's kind of clearly it's more complex than that kind of simple description, but broadly speaking, those are the kind of connections that are being made by the neural network. And so, yeah, it does join, and it joins it even with quite poor levels of granularity of data, but increase the data granularity, and you get sort of increased value from that, because clearly, what you want to understand is, how much trends, seasonality, etc., affects that. So if you've got historic data that you can bring to the table, then that makes it so much more accurate and more valuable.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Chris and Malcolm. It's been lovely kind of hearing from you. Really, really interesting presentation. And thanks everyone for listening. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.